Fantastic. All right, so we're going to go a little bit actually more into the weeds today compared to what we did Monday. So if Monday left you like super confused, that's fine. Because we need to have a plan before we actually try to implement stuff. So basically our goals today are going to be how do we make sense of all of this. So your PowerPoint on resistance training, these are all the little charts that you got, right? You've got like off-season frequency guidelines, you've got split routines, you've got all these exercises for resistance training. Basically all these things that just got thrown into your slides and it basically gets put into like a box, right? So we're just going to put all this into a box, and then if we know this stuff, then we're going to be able to apply it in a way that makes a little bit more sense, right? Because when we actually talk about trying to apply stuff within a training session, knowing all this is great, but then all of a sudden, if you try to throw all this into one training session, it's going to start to really, one, it's going to mess with your head, because then you're going to feel like you're doing a crappy job. But then two, you're probably going to destroy some people, which is not fun. So I mentioned a little bit on Monday, the big things we have to start with anything we plan is training frequency. So you don't oftentimes get to deal with that. If you have a nurse, right, and we'll go general fitness here first. If you have a nurse that works 4 days on and 3 days off and work 4 12-hour shifts for 4 nights in a row, and then they have 3 days off, what are you going to do with those 3 days in a row that they can work out, right? Let's just say you're working in general fitness. If you work with a sports team, right? These soccer guys are gone today, so what are you going to do when they have a game, right? A lot of the things you have to look at first is what are their sports schedules going to be, all right? If you're working with college athletes or high school athletes, you have to think about what their class schedule is, right? Because this class is at 10:45, those guys had a game today. You got track practice today?
Yup.
What time?
3:30.
3:30, right? So you have to be able to work around all that, and a lot of times that's not dictated by you if you're working in the sport performance realm. The thing you got to look at is what you have availability-wise, weight room, because sometimes between practice schedules, between game schedules, or just between, who else is training, like what other teams or what other people are going to be around, you've got to be able to know that availability. Then you got to look at your training age. So we talked about training age a little bit. It was on one of those charts on the first slides. Training age is one of those things where as you have people that have either no experience or a lot of experience is going to determine what exercises you select. It's going to determine how many sets and reps you do. It's going to determine how frequently you train, things like that. Because for somebody that has no training age, training twice a week generally gets all the boxes checked that you need and will make a lot of improvements. Somebody that's been training 10 years is not going to be able to survive on just twice a week because they need a bigger stimulus. We kind of talked about that a little bit with our microcycles or mesocycles on Monday, where it's like you're going to need a higher frequency and a longer cycle for more experienced individuals. So taking that individuals that have really low training age, we can get away with pretty infrequent training. Yeah?
I meant to ask you this on Monday.
Yeah.
So I've at least weightlifting wise, I've been training for 5 years now.
Yep.
Like 6 years. But I've never deadlifted, I've never done clean snatches, I've never done none of that stuff. And so how would you be able to someone who has trained a period of time, I've done 6 days, stuff like that before that. Things were good, but I've never done those type of exercises.
You've never done the big kind of major movements.
I've never done those type of exercises.
So it really depends. So when we look at training age, this is the big thing also to think about. Training age is also dictated by actual structure, right? Like if you just walk into the gym and say, I'm just gonna, we worked with an athlete a couple years ago when I used to work at the speed school. He was a pro football player, right? And guy came from Mars Hill, so he would go down to Gold's Gym on Patton Avenue. And this is what he said his workouts were like. I take some pre-workout, and then I get after it, and I just go until I can't anymore, right? That's a 22-year-old. Right? Like what, that's not, but that doesn't help us out when we're actually trying to improve performance, because that training age is how's that structured, right? I tell people that I've been training for, basically half my life, because I've been on a structured training plan for 13 out of 27 years that I've been alive. But when I actually started like lifting weights, I was like 12. But it wasn't structured. It was just, I'm gonna do a bunch of push-ups, sit-ups, and like my dad had a curl bar in the basement, and I would just do like curls all the time. Okay? So that's one of those things where that's gonna be a little bit iffy. Sometimes we have to take a step back and we look at training age. Because that's another thing. What do they know how to do, right? Like, if you don't know how to do it clean, you can't clean. Like, you're gonna have to learn that first. Like, you've never deadlifted, you're gonna have to learn how to do that first. So that's gonna have to be incorporated into how you're gonna start off your training. Other things are injury history, right? So, if you've got people with ACL tears, if you've got people with shoulder issues, injury risk factors too go into that. That's going to take a lot of communication with the sports med staff. So I know you have like 3 athletic trainers here and like 2 part-time PTs. 1 or 2 part-time physical there.
1 or 2.
1 or 2, right? So being able to assess certain risks, like baseball players, overhead, right? Doing tons of overhead movements because they're always spending time up here. Same thing with volleyball players. Being able to understand where injuries are likely to happen, because they're also going to be dictated by movement compensations. So everybody's kind of got a default pattern that they go to. If you really look at elite athletics, if you look at people that perform really, really well, really what they are is they're elite compensators. They find out ways to get around things that they don't like, that are in their way, okay? There's a coach that I've listened to, and he's talked about it. He's played in the NFL for 10 years, and he's like, I had a broken tibia, and I still played like offensive line for like a full season on a broken tibia. How he compensated for it. Now it left some compensation patterns that he had to go back and fix, but if you're aware of those things, then you start to integrate that into a training plan. This is where we always have to start, right? So everybody heard of the Hippocratic Oath that doctors have to take, right? Well, if you train anybody, doesn't matter what you're doing, rule number 1, do no harm. Because injured people don't perform, right? Like the number 1 thing you can do to, if you work in sport performance and strength and conditioning, the fastest way to get fired is make sure people aren't on the field. And that gets done by poor planning and hurting people in the weight room. So if anything, don't hurt anybody. So I like to joke because with my wrestlers, the only soft tissue injury we've had is somebody broke their nose because it took a knee to the face. Now, the kids that train with the football team, can't say much for them because half of them have low back issues, which when we talk about like issues later in this, we'll talk about back squatting and stuff like that. You also got to be aware that hurting somebody in the weight room, right, psychologically has a negative impact. So anybody in here, like terminology, things like that, if you actually want to get into the psychology of making people better, right? How many of you have a negative association when coach says, get in line, we're going to do suicides? Right? Yeah, right? Nobody likes that. 1, you're associating conditioning with death. That's not a great thing to start with. But being able to understand that the more we either A, use exercise as punishment, or if we get people hurt, people will start to have a negative association with what we're trying to get them to do. If they have a negative association with improvement, then they're not going to improve. So do no harm, don't get people hurt, don't use exercise as punishment. It's just a really bad way, right? And you'll hear this word talked, right? Buy-in. You'll hear that phrase talked a lot in fitness and performance training. You can make somebody stronger and faster by making them run 5 miles if they believe in you. It's just the truth, right? Because your mind controls a lot of things. So if you come to me and you believe me and what I'm saying because either like we have a good relationship and you like coming to see me and we go do like whatever, I can make you do anything and your chance are going to get better because the mind has that much of a power to play, in fact. So don't mess with your buy-in by getting people hurt, but then also there's some things and there's some books that I can recommend to you that really dive deep on the psychology and that stuff. So now we'll get into it. Selecting exercises and sequences, because this is where a lot of people go wrong, right? A lot of people like to flip this pyramid upside down, right? So when we look at building a base for training, especially if you're looking at low training age, we need to start with the biggest things, bang for a buck. Because if we only have 50 minutes in the weight room, right, we don't want to spend time doing stuff that's pointless, okay? So when we look at bang for your buck exercises, those are going to be your squatting patterns, your hinging patterns, your deadlifts, your cleans, your Olympic lifts. Basically, we're looking at multi-joint exercises that function across the system. We're looking at whatever's going to be the most taxing physiologically, because we don't want to do the most taxing things later in a session because you run a higher risk of getting hurt. We want the things that are going to give us the biggest return on our investment, right? If we're going to put a lot of time into something, we want a lot coming back out of it, all right? After you go through and kind of tackle maybe 1 to 2 major bang for your buck exercises, then you start to add in your accessory work, all right? So that can still be multi-joint movements, tends to be a little bit more free, like less barbell work, tends to be a little bit more dumbbell, kettlebell work, more body weight work. These are the things you're going to see that are going to basically improve what you've already worked on, right? Like if we're trying to work, let's just say we're trying to increase our leg strength, we chose a squat. How are we going to increase the other factors that may have been left out of the squat, and we can elevate all of those, okay? After we do our major accessories, right, those are still multi-joint movements. They're a little less taxing, right, so they don't require as huge of a demand from your nervous system. Then we can go into our minor accessories, right? Like, let's be real, basketball players in here? No? Yeah, right? Everybody wants to look good in those sleeveless, like, jerseys, right? Like, you know, it's like, there's a coach that I've kind of connected with, and he works with University of Houston basketball. They do curls and tricep extensions all day long because nobody wants to look skinny in a jersey, okay? But that's where you get into that stuff. It's like, if we have our big bang for our buck exercises, we have our main accessories, right? A lot of multi-joint stuff still. Then we can get into single joint accessories, all right? Now, the one thing that you're gonna see is fluff, right? Sport specificity, all right? And that's where we get into a very, what they call an uncanny valley, because when we look at sport specificity, 90% of things move the same. And that's just, if I take a track athlete, if I take a basketball player, you play sports? What do you play?
Volleyball.
Softball?
Volleyball.
Volleyball, right? So we take a volleyball player. If we look at what your training is going to consist of, the exercises are going to be pretty close to the same. It's just how we implement them that might change, okay? So when we look at sport specificity, now if we look at this pyramid, these are our priorities, right? Because a general physical base, then we looked at like our anatomical adaptations and our hypertrophy phases, our max strength phases in our periodization on Monday. This is where your priorities should lie in terms of how you implement things. And you can implement this across the session, you can implement it across the week, but sport specificity, a lot of times you'll see it as like, oh, we're gonna do rotational this, we're gonna do all these different things, and people start to mimic sporting movements. But when we really look at trying to improve somebody's physical performance, we need to start with bang for your buck and kind of work our way up, right? Because you're already gonna be doing tons of sport-specific work in practice. The most specific thing you can do for a sport is your sport. You're not gonna get faster unless you sprint, are you? No, you're not gonna get better at shooting a free throw unless you take a bunch of free throws, all right? So when we look at going into actually selecting stuff, we start from the bottom up, get the things taken care of that require a big time investment, the most taxing physiologically, and then also the most taxing on the nervous system, okay? The other thing that we're gonna have to think about when we're even starting to plan sessions, and this is the one thing that really grinds my gears a little bit because you have to start with what you can coach. And if you don't know how to coach it, you shouldn't teach it, right? This is a classic example of high school football. I've walked into numerous high school weight rooms and just turned around and walked out, right? I've never power cleaned before, right? Well, I know a lot of football coaches that don't know how to power clean and make people do power cleans, all right? If you don't know how to coach it, don't teach it. Don't put it in a program. Because when we go back to step one, right, do no harm, if you don't know how to teach it, you're more likely to get somebody hurt. All right? Now, obviously, if you want to implement something, learn how to teach it. Seek an outside source. There's books, there's things like that. Learn how to teach it. I was kind of telling Dr. York before we started, it's like, I'm testing out a new training template on myself. I've been my own guinea pig for 6 years. All right? Everything now, it's taken a physical toll. I mean, somebody asked me why I charge a lot to do like one-on-one training sessions. It's because I spent $2,500 on continuing education out of my own pocket. And it's just in 2019. And I spent another $2,000 just on physical therapy costs. And that was after insurance kicked in. All right? Because I destroyed my body for probably about 4 years before I really got smart about things and really started figuring out what works. All right? So if you don't know how to coach something, right? Learn how to coach yourself, and then also, if you have some friends that want to learn, you can kind of work with each other and coach each other in that, right? Getting the most out of time. Now this is, like I said, those are one of the big things that we have to think about is when we look at doing any kind of training, you're going to be limited by how much time you're afforded by a sport coach or somebody's schedule, your weight room availabilities, turf availabilities, whatever it is, you're only going to have a limited amount of time. So make sure we got to get the most out of this, right? So when you go to start planning, everything should start to look, into what we need to tackle, right? So when you look at your warm-ups, all right, we need to elevate the heart rate. We need to tackle big ticket mobility items, right? So if we're going to do a squat, we need to make sure our hips, knees, ankles, and back are warmed up and ready to handle any kind of load, all right? Any kind of skill work or potentiation, right? So when we talk about, you guys going over potentiation at all? A little bit, okay? So basically, how do we prime the nervous system to prepare it to produce force, okay? Because nobody walks into the gym, throws 100% of a weight, like on a bar, and then does a rep. That's just a really bad idea, okay? So when we look at warm-ups, being able to incorporate and know that we're gonna have to tackle some of this, all right? How long is it gonna take? Are you gonna rest in between like certain things? When I was running, this is back over the summer, when I was running speed and agility, like classes and kind of camps for kids, I knew that my warm-up was gonna take 15 minutes, at least for the first 3 weeks. And I knew that about week 4, week 5, I could probably get it down to 12 minutes because everybody would be used to the warm-up. And I could then start to sprinkle in other things that could either fill that extra 3 minutes, or I would get 3 more minutes on our core exercises, all right? Because then when we look at bang for your buck, all right, so we go back to the bottom of that pyramid. We've done a warm-up, now we're gonna select a core exercise, maybe 2 core exercises. When you're thinking about how much time you have, you're gonna have to consider how many warm-up sets you're gonna have to get to before you get to a working weight, all right? Because if we're trying to build max strength, we're gonna have to work at about 75% or higher of a 1-rep max, all right? How many warm-up sets is it gonna take to get us there safely, all right? What are your rest periods gonna be, right? If we're trying to, yeah, this is back to this. But if we're trying to get the most out of our training, right? We wanna build max strength, we're gonna need to rest 2 to 5 minutes. So that's gotta be included in your training plan. Supersets, trisets, when we get to accessories, all right? If we wanna save time on things, that's a lot of times where we can get some extra time and buy some time, all right? Everyone knows what a superset is, right? Combining one exercise, do an exercise, go to another, come back to the first, right? Trisets, it's kind of like a circuit, right? 1, 2, 3, go back, 1, 2, 3, right? So if we warm up, we get our big core exercises, and then we know roughly how long each exercise within any accessory work is going to take, then we can start to really manage our time effectively, all right? So that's where we got all that. Any questions on that? Okay. So now let's get even a little further in the weeds. All right. There's a lot of different ways to implement any of that. All right. Pretty common methods that you're going to see are upper body splits. So let's just say you're training Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. Monday might be a leg day, and so you're going to go lower body. All right. And you'll see this is what people call the bro split. Right. It's very based off of bodybuilding. Same thing. Your leg day, you might walk in, you might hit some strength-based squats. You might hit, after that, you might hit some hamstring work. That could be unilateral, bilateral, so single leg, double leg, however you want to call it. Depending on how you want to implement things. This is pretty common. You'll see this a lot in fitness when you're trying to build muscle mass or if you're in a hypertrophy phase. Antagonist or posterior anterior, those are different ways to split things out. Right, so if I'm going to do like a bench press, the next thing I'm going to do is a row because I pushed. That was my protagonist. Pull, that's my antagonist. All right. So that's a pretty common one. So splitting things into upper body, lower body. Some people like to do like, all right, lower body quad dominant, lower body hamstring dominant or posterior dominant. Then same thing. They do like an upper body push day, upper body pull day, which is then our other one that we can get into, right? So if we're trying to do full body training sessions, push and pull, anterior, posterior. So on my push day, I would do basically everything that's gonna tackle anteriorly, all right? So that'd be your bench presses, your squats, any flexion-based core exercises or anti-extension core exercises. Being able to understand that that one's a pretty common method also to get used, especially in sport performance, because you can accumulate volume, right? So if we're trying to build either an aerobic base or build hypertrophy, you can do a lot of work with that and still have time to recover, right? Because if you do an upper body, lower body split, if you trash your legs on Monday, well, it's gonna be a couple of days before you can train your legs again, all right? So push-pull days work pretty well to do. They work pretty well for trying to manage fatigue a little bit, especially if you have people like, if I trash your legs, you're not gonna be able to sprint very well, right? If I trash your legs, you're not gonna be able to jump very well, all right? If I trash your arms, you're not gonna be able to hit very well, okay? So being able to understand, there are cost benefits to each different type. Push-pull, right? Well, a pull day might fry your shoulders and hamstrings and put you at a higher risk for hamstring injuries, right? At least for a day or two, okay? Then you have main movement based, all right? So some people call this the super training approach, at least that's how I've kind of understood it. This is where you see a lot of like powerlifters and stuff use, but you have your main exercise selected and then everything you pick supports that exercise, okay? So we'll come back, let's use the deadlift as an example for this one. Let's just say your main exercise is a trap bar deadlift, then we have to think, all right, what helps me improve that main movement, right? Well, I know that the lats stabilize the lumbar spine, so I need to target my lats a little bit more. I know that the hamstrings can take a little bit more volume because I can isolate that part of the posterior chain. Then all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, let's target the hamstring exercise, all right? Your glutes play a factor into that, so let's target the glutes a little bit. I need to not flex over, I need to be able to keep my back nice and straight, all right? So doing a core exercise that's basically what we call anti-flexion, so resisting flexion, all right? So that's kind of a main movement-based approach. So these are pretty main options that you see. Again, what can you coach well? What do you know how to implement? What time of year, what training phase you're in? That's all going to dictate that. Like I said, I'm going to put one of these slides in every single presentation because everybody's got a clear bias on something, all right? So I am a main movement-based person. It's what I coach well. It's where my thought processes go. Because I work with weightlifters and powerlifters, everything's basically based on how can I make a power clean heavier, a snatch heavier, a squat, a deadlift, or a bench press heavier. Main movement-based training works pretty well, all right? And it's also just how I like to train myself. It just makes sense to me. I get really bored with doing hypertrophy work. So, all right. So we're gonna go through some of these then, that way you can kind of have a baseline example, all right? And this is kind of a basic template that you can use to say, how do I plan out? Let's just say I had an hour, all right? This is an hour-long training session, so any example I'm gonna give you is all just based off of 60 minutes, all right? Well, I have my warm-up, all right? So I've got jumping jacks, I've got some air squats, I've got some push-ups, right? So I'll do 20 jumping jacks, 10 air squats, 5 push-ups. I'll go through that 3 times. Not gonna hurt anybody because let's be real, it's very hard to hurt yourself doing push-ups and air squats. And jumping jacks are pretty, unless you are just totally fried and you're just, if you can't walk, then jumping jacks might hurt you, but this is pretty simple. That's gonna get your heart rate going a little bit though, because if you go through that without any rest, that's gonna work pretty well. We'll go through our big ticket mobility items. So the 90-90 hip box, if you've gone through any of the functional movement screening or stuff like that, you start to see some of those things. But I know that for my main movement, I've selected a back squat. So my big ticket mobility things, I need to get my hips warmed up. So the 90-90 will work on our hip internal and external rotation. The cat-cow is going to take care of my spinal mobility. And then hip airplane is going to take care of a little bit more of that hip stability and control, okay? Now notice, I'm resting, no rest here, right? Roughly, this should take about 15 minutes, right? And you can allot that time for that. You think, okay, 20 jumping jacks is going to take about 20 seconds, all right? Air squats, 10 air squats is going to take about 12 seconds. 5 push-ups is going to take about 10 seconds. And so you multiply that out, and then you can kind of figure out how much time you need. These movements, then you kind of fill in and say, okay, hey, I know that's going to take me a couple extra minutes to get through those. Then I got my potentiation, so trying to prime the nervous system, get it going, right? So broad jump, just jumping out as far as you can. Resting 60 seconds, right? So we're trying to just get power going, just trying to get the body ready to produce some force. Main exercise, squat, right? Pretty simple. But notice something, right? So every single time, right, there's a warm-up listed, empty bar, 50% by 5, 60% by 5, 70% by 5, 75% by 3, 80% 3 by 3, right? And we're resting 1 to 3 minutes because in your warm-up sets, the empty bar is basically like doing an air squat for most people. 50%, rest a minute as you change your weights to go to 60%. 60% you rest a minute to, a minute and a half, to get to 70%. 70% you rest a minute to 2 minutes to get to 75, and then you go into your working sets where you might rest 3 minutes. You can literally get all that work done in 15 minutes, and it shouldn't be terrible. All right? Now, accessory work, all right? Now, we looked at the main squat, right? That's a pushing movement. What else can we get in our pushing movements? Well, we're going to do a dumbbell bench press, so we can get something upper body going. Notice this is a strength-based program, so we have 4 sets of 6. All right, so we're gonna go a little bit heavier. Rear foot elevated split squats, right? So, or Bulgarian split squats, if everybody knows what that is. All right, Bulgarians didn't come up with it, that's a long story. So, dumbbell bench press, we can superset that, right? So I have those listed here. Again, a minute to 2 minutes to rest. 4 sets. Should take me about 10 minutes, right? If we just say it's going to take me 45 seconds a set, then I rest 1 to 2 minutes. Should take me about 10 minutes to get those 4 sets in, all right? Then we can go even secondary accessory block. I have a couple more pushing movements. I can have a lateral lunge. I can have a half kneeling dumbbell press, and then we're going overhead, pushing with the shoulder, going laterally, especially for those that play field sports. Court sports, right? Like a lateral lunge is you can't get into a deep position if you're not strong there, okay? And then anterior, right? Because we're kind of on that push day, so we've got a plank, all right? Again, 60 seconds between sets. Move from exercise to exercise without any rest. You get 60 seconds. Should take about 12 minutes, right? So that's how you can start to look at, all right, how long is an exercise going to take? And how much rest am I giving them? Should be able to lay out a plan and guess pretty close within about 5 minutes of where it should take you, okay? Here's just a movement-based Session, same thing, 60 minutes.